Well, hello, my favorite AP class students. Hope y'all are doing well. As we are continuing to roll through Unit 6, today's video is going to concentrate on Unit 6.3, Indigenous Responses to State Expansion. Remember, we're right in the middle of the age of imperialism, which is when some of the bigger mother countries are now taking over smaller countries, mostly for economic advantage. But there are some other factors as well. So again, if you want to review that, go back to the video on 6.2 or 6.1 to introduce us. But today we're going to concentrate on indigenous responses to state expansion. So let me lay down the context for you. The ideas of the Enlightenment, the things like democracy and liberty and things like that, Western style education, started moving to Africa, Asia, and South America. And because of all this westernization, we're going to see more intense nationalism occur. And that's where every country thinks that they are the most dominant than any other country. So today we're going to look at this essential question. How and why did internal and external factors influence state building between 1750 and 1900? So there's a lot of information in this particular video, so I hope you pay attention. I'm going to stand out of the way so you can pause it here if you want to write this down. We'll talk about it. So let's start with the Balkans. And you remember in a previous video I mentioned what the Balkans were. The Balkans are that area in Eastern Europe down in what was the Ottoman Empire. Steve Heimler's video, which I'll put a link to that at the end, is going to kind of tell you where that is and show it to you on a map. But Balkan nationalism, everybody thinks now that the fever is for these independence movements to now take place. And they are all inspired by the French Revolution. The thing that makes the Balkans a little bit more unique is that now there is ethnic nationalism, which means all the Slavic peoples, particularly in this area, are now seeking independence. And folks, World War I, when it finally breaks out, it's going to be because of these Baltic tensions. That's where World War I is going to begin, in the Balkan region. And that should come as no surprise to students of history here. So let's look at some examples here of nationalist and independence movements. 1815, the nation of Serbia. Greece in 1832. They won their wars for independence then. And again, they're both rebelling against the Ottoman rule. Remember what the Ottoman Empire has been called at this time. It's becoming known as the sick man of Europe. Other places that are going to rebel against Ottoman rule: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Bulgaria, Serbia and Russia. This is important to understand World War I. Serbia and Russia, those two countries have an alliance that dates back to this. Predates the First World War by several decades. The Russo-Turkish War. And there was a treaty that they signed in Berlin which freed Bulgaria, Romania, and Montenegro, but it gave Bosnia and Herzegovina to Austria-Hungary, to a different empire. So no longer under Ottoman rule, but now under Austro-Hungarian rule. And that, you would think that's where the problems end. Wrong. That is where the problems are going to begin, unfortunately. So let's take a look at that. Well, let's come back to that in a different video, actually. As far as the Americas go, and I'm switching gears again, going to a different country. Let me stand out the way in case you want to take some notes here. In the Americas, we have, this is a little bit of U.S. history now, the Cherokee Nation. After 1800, the Cherokee Nation worked to assimilate with white settler culture. Now, keep in mind, a lot of that's going to be forced by new laws in the United States for a U.S.-style constitution, literacy, farming, weaving, architecture, etc. And they are going to be forced to relocate to Indian Territory after gold is discovered on their land in 1829. A resistance movement that spans native populations all over the U.S. is a ritual known as the Ghost Dance. This is something you'll cover more in U.S. history next year. But just to give you a foundation, is that ritual ghost dances would be used to encourage the dead to come back and drive out the whites. So that's a little bit of superstition that is permeating those Native American cultures. In 1890, this is all going to come to a clash at Wounded Knee in 1890. And that should say that's a religious movement. And it says religious movements, and it's going to end the Indian Wars, and that's going to encourage more rebellions. So the struggle between white settlers and Native Americans in North America is really going to start heating up at this particular time. So we've got that going on. Again, it's all about independence movements throughout the world. That's really what this unit is about. So moving right along, we're going to look at continuing on in the Americas now. And now we're going to kind of go a little bit further south. So Tupac Amaru, and not this Tupac, this is a different Tupac, but interesting name. Tupac Amaru II was an educated Jesuit who is descendant of an Incan ruler. And he leads a revolt in the nations of Peru, Bolivia, and Argentina that starts with killing the colonial officials for cruelty, and that would be the colonial officials of Spain. This is going to lead to a general Indian revolt against Spain, supported by many of the Creoles. We mentioned them in a previous video, so you may want to go back to that. In 1781, he's captured. And tortured, and then he is tortured or killed by the Spanish. We believe he was tortured and killed. But anyway, speaking of Mexico, we have some French intervention happening now. Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, King Napoleon III of France, works to overthrow Benito Juarez in Mexico. France wants to imperialize Mexico, mainly because Mexico owes them money, so they said that's our justification. That seems only fair. We should be able to take you over. The Archduke Maximilian was made the Emperor of Mexico in 1864. They're going to go to war with France, and it's going to be a 3-year war, which Mexico is going to win. Maximilian will be executed in 1867, and Juarez will resume his presidency. So again, this is imperial oppression and the people fighting back. And you can tell the imperialists don't always win. That's what's important here. So like I said, we're doing a little world tour of situations like this. So here, let me pause in case you want to take notes. Okay. Next slide talks about movements in South Asia. I mentioned the sepoys in a previous video. Let me discuss about them. Again, those are Indian, Muslim, and Hindu soldiers that are working for the British government. However, they were upset. Remember I said they were in a previous video I mentioned that they were a very sensitive group of people that if mistreated in the slightest way, they're going to revolt. Well, guess what? They've been now mistreated in the slightest way. A rumor spread that, this is in the 1850s, 1857, a rumor spread that the British were using pig and cow fat on bullets in the guns to make the cartridges shoot easier. Well, if you know anything about Hinduism and Muslims, you will know how they perceive both of those animals. You know, pork and beef, very holy to the respective religions. That's going to offend them severely, whether this was a true rumor or not. And by the way, you can pretty much bet it was true. So then they revolt. And this becomes known as the Sepoy Mutiny or the Sepoy Rebellion. It's a movement that spreads throughout India, violently crushed by Britain. And the only reason why is because the Hindus, the native Hindus, couldn't materialize any kind of cohesion because of all the different social divisions. Remember, they're still practicing the caste system at that time, so that's important. So what we see now is a rise of Indian nationalism, education, communication, and transportation, and that's going to lead to independence movements that will eventually culminate with Gandhi and his independence movement in the 20th century. Here's the outcome of it. The Great Britain exiled the Mughal emperor for involvement in the Sepoy Rebellion. That's going to effectively end the Mughal Empire. And Great Britain takes more of an active role in governing India. So instead of the British East India Company doing the governing, now it's going to be a new government known as the Raj, the British Raj, which is going to rule India for nearly a century, 1858 to 1947. Many Indians attended British universities. And then finally in 1885, the Indian National Congress was established, and they started to air their grievances against Great Britain, and that's going to become a call for self-rule. As I said, 1947, because that's going to end with the movement of Mahatma Gandhi. in Indian liberation. So you see how some things from the past kind of transcend, and now it definitely affects an event that will occur in the next unit, which would be 1900 to present. So anyway, that's kind of a thing right there for India. Let's move a little bit further southeast. I'm going to stop right there so you can pause, so I can pause, and so you can take some notes if you need to. But we're moving now to Southeast Asia. By the 1880s, the only independent country in Southeast Asia was Siam. Again, that is to modern-day Thailand. The rest was under the control of the Spanish, Dutch, British, and French. Vietnam is going to be a place that's going to constantly resist French imperialism. Many will rally behind a 12-year-old emperor. 12 years old. Well, what did you do when you were 12? You didn't run Vietnam. I know that much. Ham Ni, the French raided the royal palace. He would later be exiled to Algeria, but Vietnam is going to fight resistance constantly. Matter of fact, they're going to fight resistance until 1975. And yes, this is going to involve the Vietnam War that many of your grandfathers may have fought in. So that's Vietnam. That's what's happening there. The Philippine resistance. The Philippines were moving further east. Education started in 1863, which led to Enlightenment-inspired movements like a propaganda movement under a guy named Jose Rizal. Discussed him in Unit 5. He was killed, which was actually shocking. Well, in 1896, the Philippines launched a revolution that's a result of education plus nationalism. So people, they're trying to build the fever of revolt, and sometimes they have to use propaganda to make that happen. Many revolutionaries were exiled, but after the United States won the Spanish-American War, they returned expecting freedom. So in 1899, after the Spanish-American War, the Philippines were given to the United States from something called the Treaty of Paris. Now, this is going to lead to an unnamed Philippine-American War, where in 1902 we won. We had about 20,000 troops, and about 2,000 troops, and about 20,000 civilians died. Now, this war was kept out of the newspapers, and you'll learn more about that in U.S. history next year. Resistance is going to continue in the region, but it is going to remain a possession of ours until 1906. So that is not the correct year. So let me get that fixed. But anyway, that's discussing the Philippines. Moving further, we have Australia. Let's see what's going on in Australia. The Aborigines in Australia had existed for around 50,000 years and one of the oldest continuous cultures on planet Earth. I think it was the last video where I mentioned that Australia was a British prison colony or a penal colony in 1788, and it's said to treat the Aboriginals kindly, but it does not recognize their land ownership. The Aborigines are not British citizens, so that means they're not protected by British law. Instead, what you're seeing is Aborigines killed by the thousands, and all they're trying to do is to protect their land. That's it. New Zealand, if we move further east, we talked in the last video about the Treaty of Waitangi, where the British said they would protect the property of their native people called the Maori. And that's, of course, going to lead to war as well. The British do win this war in 1846. And the Maori will continue to try and protect their land. In 1861, the British ignored the treaty with the Maori and sent troops to take land as well. Another war, another uneasy peace, and by 1900, most of the Maori land was lost. So this was one of those reactions that didn't go in the favor of the Maori, which, once again, are the native peoples of New Zealand. So anyway, that takes care of the southeastern Asia. And let's switch now over to Africa. Let's look at some African resistance here. African resistance developed much later than Indian resistance because Europeans had been in India much, much longer. By World War I, however, Western-educated Africans had a shared nationalistic identity known as Pan-Africanism. We're going to start out here in a place called the Sokoto Caliphate. And this was a new nation that was established by Usman Dan Fodio. And his goal was to purify Islam in the Hausa tribes, focusing on the slave trade, even though the British are working hard to try to end that right at this point. and for economic opportunity. And the British are continually trying to stop their slave ships. So let me make sure I can, here we go. The largest African empire, the Sokoto Caliphate, and because it's a caliphate, you can tell it is a Islamic empire. The largest African empire since the 16th century, until Great Britain absorbs it into what is today modern day Nigeria. Okay, so, and then we go to South Africa. The native Xhosa people do not want to be ruled by Europeans. You see the common denominator here? Nobody wants to be ruled by Europeans. Makes sense. But they will fight the British for over 4 decades for control. And the Xhosa cattle began getting sick from the British cattle. They killed their cattle. They destroyed crops in the cattle killing movement. And I guess you could say the religious idea behind that is to awaken the spirits to drive out the Europeans. This is going to lead to famine, as wars like this often do. And the British will then also defeat the powerful Zulu kingdom in something called the Anglo-Zulu War. So the British are busy fighting off other people trying to resist rule from them. Kind of makes you wonder, why did they even bother? Well, economic power is very, very important to these people during that time. Moving right along, our last slide here, continuing on in Africa. The Samori Touré War. Samori Touré, who you see pictured up there, led warriors to establish a kingdom in what is today Guinea. They are opposing French annexation this time, not British. The French succeeded, so he tries to extend his empire in other directions. Doesn't work. He's captured and exiled in 1898. The Ya Ashantewa War. The British wanted this empire in what is today present-day Ghana, right there on the West African coast. 4 wars were unsuccessful for Great Britain. The 5th war, though, known as the Ya Ashantewa War, led a rebellion against British, and she is a queen, by the way. The last African war that was ever led by a woman. Thought that was pretty interesting. The British won this in 1900. She, of course, was exiled, and Ashanti becomes part of the Gold Coast, right there in the area of Ghana and Ivory Coast. And lastly, we have the Mahdist Revolt. This took place in East Africa. The guided one, Muhammad Ahmad, said he would restore glory to Islam. Kind of makes you think now why many Muslims in this part of the world are so suspicious of Westerners. Well, it could be because they continually imperialize them nonstop throughout this entire 1750 to 1900 part that we've been discussing. Anyway, he just helps Sudan use religion to fight against Egypt, and by 1882 they will have control of the region. What you interestingly see here is that Britain and Egypt came together to push this group of people out. Now, they won in 1885, but not long after, Muhammad Ahmad dies that year, and then the movement itself disintegrates after that, and the British end up taking Sudan in 1898. So I don't know if you've been keeping score or not about, like, gee, which movement was stronger, like who won and who lost. Whether it was Britain versus whoever or France versus whoever. Sometimes whoever won, and sometimes the imperial countries won. Either way, what this is doing is it is fueling nationalism. Excuse me. It's fueling nationalism, which is going to be one of the key ingredients that's going to start the Great War in 1914. So let me stand out of the way real quick. So in the next video, we're going to be looking at global economic development. And that's going to be the topic of Unit 6.4. A lot of information I just covered here in 19 minutes. So I encourage you, again, to watch Steve Heimler's video on Unit 6.3. And the link to that is right there, like it always is. You can click on that. And I hope you all have a great day, and you continue to take care of yourselves during these interesting times. Hope you all have a great day.